Bible is full of stories that we all know and love. But how well do we know them? The answer might surprise you. The Bible you thought you knew is going to dive deep into the exquisite details of the biblical stories that make them fascinating and transforming. In this week's podcast, we will take a look at a text that is pertinent to the season of Advent. More precisely, we will treat the genealogy of Jesus as it is found in the Gospel of Matthew. The genealogy occurs in Matthew chapter 1, the first 17 verses. Perhaps it might help a little to begin with a thought experiment. Let us imagine that the writer of this gospel is talking to a prospective publisher. The publisher has already read the manuscript. It is not difficult to believe that the publisher's initial reaction was negative. Why? Because the beginning of any book has to draw in the reader, be compelling enough to tempt the reader to continue reading, and do almost anything to grab attention. The publisher thinks that the story is quite good, but no reader is going to get past the genealogy. Genealogies are boring. Usually, the only genealogy that a person takes interest in is his or her own. Paying attention to another family's genealogy comes under the category of spending an evening watching a neighbor's vacation slides. But this is not just any family's genealogy. The writer of this gospel knew that reciting these names would immediately arrest attention. These are the most famous Israelite names ever listed, and virtually every one of his potential readers would be more than familiar with these names. Indeed, our writer explains to the prospective publisher, "Trust me, when people read these names, they will continue reading eagerly and with pronounced interest." As it turns out, the Gospel of Matthew has been a bestseller for 2 millennia, and it is still in print. It turns out that starting a story with a genealogy is not such a bad idea, depending on the names in this genealogical list. When the genealogy is introduced, we are told that this genealogy pertains to Jesus Christ. Since Christ is a title, translating Hebrew Messiah, we know from the beginning that this Jesus fellow is being presented as the Israelite or Jewish Messiah. This makes Jesus a big deal. Then, right after that provocative introduction, we learn that this Jesus is son of David and son of Abraham. Of course, son here means that David and Abraham were Jesus' ancestors. But why this order? You do not need to be all that familiar with the Bible to know that Abraham preceded David in the biblical chronology. Abraham first appears in Genesis 11. His story begins the story of Israel's famous ancestors. This story includes patriarchs and matriarchs. One thinks of Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Leah, Rachel, Zilpah, Bilhah, and the like. Genesis is the very first book of the Bible. On the other hand, David does not appear until 1 Samuel 16. Why in the world should David's name come before Abraham's? Without Abraham, the story would have never gotten off the ground. To be sure, David had a prominent part in that story. However, without Abraham and Sarah and the other ancestors, there would never have been someone named David. Why then does he have pride of place in Jesus' genealogy? Clearly, the answer to that question involves David's role in Israel. He was Israel's king. Indeed, he was a king with whom God had made an unconditional, eternal covenant, as it is recorded in 2 Samuel 7. According to Matthew, and the other Gospels for that matter, Jesus is also to have the role of King of Israel, or the King of the Jews. That is why David comes before Abraham in this initial introduction. As the genealogy itself starts, we are immediately intrigued by another name. Just as we might have expected, the names begin with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in verse 2 of chapter 1. So far, so good. But after Jacob is mentioned, his famous 12 sons are in line. Perhaps naming all 12 might have seemed tedious. If so, which son should be mentioned? In a culture that considered firstborn sons to be special, we have an excellent candidate. Reuben was Jacob's first son. His mother was Leah. But we are not told that Jacob was the father of Reuben. Instead, we are told that Jacob was the father of Judah and his brothers. Interestingly, Judah was Jacob's fourth son. Remember that Jacob's first 4 children were by Leah. Those boys, in order, were Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. Given this order, why should Judah receive such attention? It would have made perfect sense to indicate that Jacob was the father of Reuben and his brothers. It seems that Judah is given pride of place in this instance for the same reason that David was named before the great patriarch Abraham was. Judah was, after all, the ancestor of none other than David. Remember also that when Jacob prophesied about his 12 sons' future prospects, when he came to Judah, he said that, quote, "The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet." That's in Genesis 49, verse 10. In other words, Judah's descendants are slated to be royalty. They are designated to be future kings. That is precisely the emphasis that this genealogy makes. As the genealogy continues, stress on kingship is maintained. Indeed, the genealogy breaks pattern by, for the first time, mentioning not only fathers, but mothers. That is unusual in biblical genealogies, but not in this case. When Judah's name is presented, we learn that he was the father of Perez and Zerah, twin boys whose mother was a woman named Tamar, who was Judah's daughter-in-law. The sordid circumstances which led to Judah sleeping with and thereby impregnating Tamar are narrated in Genesis 38. It needs to be kept in mind that Tamar was a Canaanite. As the genealogy continues, only Perez survives. Zerah and his family were destroyed according to Joshua 7. Perez then was the father of Hezron, Hezron the father of Ram, Ram the father of Amminadab, Amminadab the father of Nahshon, Nahshon the father of Salmon, and Salmon the father of Boaz. That's in verses 3 through 6 of chapter 1 of Matthew. Just as this repetition becomes difficult for our Western years, we get another woman introduced. This time it is Rahab, the famous Canaanite prostitute, or madame, whose story is featured in Joshua 2. She became part of Israel due to her helping the Israelite spies and due to her impressive confession of Israelite faith. Rahab was Boaz's mother. That's in verse 5 of chapter 1 of Matthew. Boaz was the father of Obed, at which point a third female is named. This time it is Ruth, another non-Israelite. Ruth was a Moabitess. That means that her ancestry can be traced to another sordid story. That episode is recounted in Genesis 19, verses 30 through 38. That was when, after the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, Lot's daughters thought that they and their father were the only people left on earth. Because of their desperation, they got their father drunk, slept with him, and got pregnant by him. That produced Moab and Ammon. Therefore, Moabites came about through incest. Nevertheless, Ruth also made it into the genealogy. So, Boaz was the father of Obed by Ruth, and of course, Obed was the father of Jesse, none other than the father of David. That's in verse 6 of chapter 1. But when David is named, his title also accompanies him. He is not merely David, another name in a long list of names. He is David the King. That's in verse 6. Once again, Jesus' connections to Israelite royalty are stressed. Toward the end of this genealogy, another set of names requires comment. Everyone knows that Joseph was Jesus' father, but comments surrounding his name are quite interesting. Joseph is introduced as the quote-unquote husband of Mary, to whom Jesus was born. When we are informed of this datum, the genealogy adds that Jesus was the one who is called Christ. This means that Mary is the fifth woman in Jesus' genealogy. I know that you can count. So far, we have only mentioned 3 other women, Tamar, Rahab, and Ruth. Why does not Mary constitute the 4th woman? This is because one other woman is alluded to, but whose name is not mentioned. When the genealogy names David, it goes on to point out that David was the father of Solomon, whose mother was the wife of Uriah. Indeed, one has to supply the word wife, since the Greek text simply has the definite article, the one of Uriah. That's in verse 7. We know her from the Old Testament, of course, as Bathsheba, whose story is recounted in 2 Samuel 12. That makes Mary the 5th woman listed in Jesus' genealogy. One more comment is in order. Joseph's father was Jacob. That's in verse 16 of chapter 1. That means that at least the name of Jacob has come full circle. This suggests that, just as the first Jacob initiated the line that eventuated in the royal family in Israel, so the second Jacob was the father of that new king. Let me remind you that after this podcast is available, we'll take the Christmas week off, and the next one will be on January 2nd. In the meantime, go to my website, faspina.com. Let me know what your email is. And if you have questions you'd like me to answer, email me at fspina106@gmail.com. I want to thank you so very much for listening to The Bible You Thought You Knew. I have a question for you. Do you have a question or topic that you'd like me to cover on the podcast? If so, all you need to do is head over to Apple Podcasts and do 2 simple things. 1, leave a rating and review telling me what you think of the podcast. 2, in that review, ask anything you want related to the Bible. That's all you have to do. Then, listen in to hear your question answered on a future episode. Join us next time on The Bible You Thought You Knew when we discuss Jesus' personal Bible. God bless.